You're listening to the Voice for Business podcast, episode 71. In today's episode, I'm sharing with you my best tips on how to attract more listeners to your podcast. That's coming up next.
Ready to learn what it means to have a voice for business? To utilize your voice to create the influence, impact, and income you desire. Join me, Katherine Beck, voice actor and voice coach, as I show you how to show up and stand out as the voice of your business. Learn my best tips on how to uncover your true voice, to speak with authority, and establish a personal connection to your audience that will leave them wanting to hear more. This is the Voice for Business podcast.
We will dive into today's podcast in just a minute, but first, I want to give a big shout out to Nerd Nina, who sent me this 5-star review and says, "Such a brilliant teacher and so full of wisdom. Worth a listen and definitely worth checking out her classes." Well, thank you so much, Nina. And I will tell you this, it has been an absolute joy to have you in my classes and watching you grow over the past year. I really appreciate your 5-star review, and I'm so happy that you are a listener to the podcast. And hey, if you are out there listening to this podcast and you are loving what you hear, do me a favor, click those 5 stars, leave me a short review, and let me know what you think of the podcast, and you will get featured right here on the show. So if you are loving this podcast, then go ahead and leave us a review. All right, now let's jump into today's episode, how to attract more listeners to your podcast. Now, I gotta say, I never even thought that when I started my podcast, my first podcast over a year ago, that I would be considered a podcast expert. But I have noticed this weird thing happening where people have been asking me for my advice on starting a podcast, running a podcast, my interview technique, advice on their podcast intro, and so on and so on. And I thought, gee, okay, well, what have I done that is so different to others that have a podcast? Because there's a lot of podcasts out there, let me tell you. So I started thinking about that, and I haven't been at this podcast thing for a very long time. And actually, I was really hesitant for many years to start a podcast myself. So I get it. You know, if you're out there and you're thinking about starting your podcast, but you keep putting it off, I have been there myself. I get it. So I had to think, well, what am I doing that maybe is a bit different? I mean, I am still slightly in shock when people say, "Oh, I listened to your podcast. I love your podcast." It always gets to me because you forget that there are listeners. You know that there are listeners. You know that your podcast is getting downloaded and people are subscribing and listening and you're getting the occasional reviews, but you forget about that. You know, you go off like today, I'm sitting here recording this podcast episode, but you forget then what happens after you've recorded it and you press publish, that the next step is people are going to listen. So you forget about that step. So I am in shock when people ask me for advice, but it is really great and it's well received. And I love when people say that they love my podcast. And that's really a great thing because you don't always hear from your listeners. You don't always get that feedback. So when you get it, and you know that what you're saying is really resonating with somebody and really helping them to see things or hear things differently, makes you feel good. Makes you feel like, okay, I'm on the right track with this podcast thing. So when, lately I've been getting a lot of people asking me about podcasts, I thought, let's do an episode on how to attract more listeners, to how to really catch their attention and keep their attention through a podcast. So that's where the evolution of this episode came from. So let's look at what I do through the podcast that attracts and sustains and engages my listeners to continue to tune in week after week to refer my podcast to other people. So let's look into that. So here is what I've come up with, my 4 tips for how to attract more listeners to your podcast. Tip number 1 is connection. Now, what I mean by connection is building that personal connection with your audience so they feel like you're having a real conversation with them. Like it feels like you're talking to them one-on-one. And when you can do that and you're building that relationship with your listeners, that thing that people always talk about, the know, like, and trust. And I get it, that is easier said than done. I totally get that. I know it is hard to speak in front of a microphone when nobody is actually there and pretend like you're actually speaking to someone. But here's the thing, you can't afford to speak like you're speaking in front of a microphone. You got to imagine like you're actually speaking to a real human being. And if you're in your head, well, then you're not connected to your listeners. And if you're reading off of a page of notes or bullet points or a script because your audience is not there and it sounds like you're reading off of your notes, we're going to hear that. We're going to hear that disconnect, and that might even repel us or bore us from listening. We might listen to that one episode, but we may not come back for more. So you may have the most profound things to say. You might be the wisest of the wise. But if you lack that personal connection, well, then your message is getting lost and not heard because your audience has already turned off the episode. They're not listening to you anymore. So we need to, first and foremost, create that connection, that personal connection, that bond with your audience. Number 2 is speaking with feeling. This is so key, and this is what I love to do in the podcast and just in general when I communicate. Because as human beings, we are emotional creatures, and part of that connection that your audience is craving is to feel seen and heard, and that includes feelings. They want to know that you understand how they feel. And if you are not speaking with feeling, then you are potentially losing the attention of your listeners. But if you want to attract more listeners, one of the easiest and one of the most effective ways to do this is to feel. Because when you feel, your audience will feel. So here's an example of me speaking without any feeling. I am focusing on the words, and now I am going to think inside of my head and start to rush because I don't want to take up too much time for my listeners. But if I breathed and I allowed whatever feelings and emotions I'm feeling in the moment as I connect with my audience to come out as I'm speaking in front of the microphone, this will start to evoke a feeling in my listeners. And you can hear the difference in my voice as I add joy or passion or inspiration as I speak. You can actually literally hear it in my voice. That is the power of your voice. That is the power of speaking with feeling. And that will most definitely attract more listeners to your podcast. All right, number 3 is using your vocal toolkit. Your vocal toolkit. Well, what is your vocal toolkit? I'm going to tell you. Thank you for asking. Now, this is what so many podcasters are not utilizing in their podcast. And I find this so fascinating and so interesting because you're literally using your voice in a podcast. You have the most incredible instrument at your disposal, and here you are not utilizing all the tools in your voice toolkit. You might be using 1 or 2 tools. You might be communicating to your audience just on one note. But if you start to wonder why your listeners aren't listening to you or listening to the rest of your podcast or returning week after week to listen to you more, it could be that you're like a one-note wonder. So let me break it down for you. You've got melody in your toolkit, your tone of voice. And that's really going to either attract or repel people through your tone. So like we were talking about speaking with feeling. If you're feeling nervous, we're going to hear that nerves and it's going to affect your tone. If you're speaking with joy, well, you can hear some warmth in my voice when I speak from a very happy place. Your tone changes, it shifts to respond to how you're feeling inside. So that's your tone or your melody. Then you've got your volume. So you could be loud, you could be soft, and you can have a variety of different volumes within your podcast. You've got your pace, your rhythm. So if everything is said really fast or everything is said really slow, well, it's going to tune your audience out. They're going to be bored, or you're going to go so fast that they can't keep up with you. Right? So we have to find that rhythm and those rhythm shifts. And that is a really, really, really great way to keep your audience on their toes, to keep them listening and wanting more, is to vary up that rhythm your pace. Okay, so we've talked about tone, we've talked about volume, and we've talked about pace. What about the pause? Pausing can be really effective as well. So when you can use those pauses in real specific moments, it can really make a thought or an opinion land, and it gives your audience a chance to think about it before you move on to the next thing. So using those pauses can be very beneficial as well. And when you vary all of these tools in your vocal toolkit, you're going to keep your audience engaged, guessing, and wanting to hear more from you. And I think I read somewhere online that there's over 2 million podcasts now. And if that is true, that's a lot of podcasts. That's a lot of competition, isn't it? Now, granted, not all of those podcasts are in your category or in your niche, but I guarantee most of these podcast hosts are not utilizing their voice toolkit, are not utilizing their vocal toolkit. So if you do want to easily stand out in the podcast world, it's so easy. Use your voice toolkit to easily attract more listeners to tune in to listen to you each and every week. Doing that is going to stand out because I guarantee most people aren't utilizing their voice toolkit. And number 4, last but certainly not least, is have fun and show your personality. And this is my favorite thing about having a podcast, and I think why so many of my students who work with me have said they found me through my podcast. I believe it's a great way to let your guard down and show a little bit about who you are, your personality, being fun, your playful side, that you're a real human being, that you have the same thoughts and feelings and perspectives as your listener. That's where you find that common bond. And for me, I really believe that business should be fun. So I like to incorporate a lot of fun into the podcast. That means letting my fun side of my personality shine through each and every time I get in front of the microphone to record. But whatever your personality is, share it with your audience. Let them see the real you, hear the real you through the podcast, because it's a great way to attract your ideal listeners, your ideal audience, to continue to listen in, to tune in with you each and every week. So there you have it. Those are my 4 tips to attracting more listeners to your podcast. I want you to give those a try and then let me know how you go on your podcast. Or if you're showing up for a podcast interview on somebody else's podcast, you don't have your own podcast, give these a try as well. And by all means, please let me know, DM me on the Instagrams and tell me how you went. And if you are ready to start learning how to stand out as the voice of your business, if you're ready to dive deeper into your voice toolkit, then I have a great guide for you to get started. Head over to katherinebeck.com/voice and it's yours. And remember, if you love this episode, go ahead, let me know. Take a screenshot of the show and share it with me on your Instagram story and tag me in it at Katherine_Beck_. You can find me there. If you got any questions or topics you'd like to hear on the podcast, just send me a DM and let me know. And coming up next week on the show, we are talking podcast tech. I am sharing with you all my favorite tech tools and software that I use to produce my podcasts each and every week. Now make sure to share this show with all your friends, let them know what's coming up next week, and invite them to tune in with you and learn how to show up, speak up, and stand out as the voice of your business. Until then, go on, get out there and use that powerful voice of yours, and I'll see you back here next time.